In 2005, December, the then President of Kenya, Mwai Kibaki, appointed me to be Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Information and Communication. To say the least, I didn't know exactly what that entailed, coming from the university into government. But then when I got to the office, I sat there for the first day and I looked around to people and I started to ask a question, what is it? What does it mean? And it is then that I discovered that we had had problems for many years in this country to leverage ICTs for transformation of the economy. And what I did, sat down with a few people, developed a document, 7-page document, and highlighted 5 policy measures. The first one was to deal with infrastructure, that we deal with infrastructure, ICT infrastructure comprehensively. And second was encourage development of local content and applications. And the third policy was build enough capacity, but because I knew our government did not have enough resources, I said we would leverage public-private partnerships and develop the infrastructure that we wanted. The last one was we create employment. With those 5 policy statements, we worked on infrastructure. Within 18 months, we had the undersea cable. But my fear was that we had tried to get this for 40 years because we feared that there was too much capacity, that the country cannot utilize this. And so I started to market the cable. I went to a place called IHUB, which was just beginning, to preach, to tell young people that we need to utilize this capacity. And they started using it, but halfway through, they asked me, where can we get data, especially government data? And I said, well, I will try. I went back to government and I was told that government data can never be put out there because we have the Official Secrets Act. And then I sought to talk to the president, and he gave me access. I asked him, Mr. President, young people need data to develop applications which would create employment. He looked at me and said, what is the problem? I said, Your Excellency, there is a law which hinders this, but if you allowed, we can proceed. And that was my first time we broke the law and was allowed to take the data and open it up to the public. And within a very short time, there were so many applications developed. I was very encouraged. And began to study some of the data that is not, that is very old, that we call it dead data. At Kenyatta National Hospital, we discovered National Hospital alone, we could tell that somebody born in some section in central Kenya, 1 in 3 has diabetes. And we could predict and say most of the people would get diabetes in small area. Some other places we could get hypertension. And I said there is something more with this data. But I kept on going to conferences after we opened up the data, went to Brazil to talk about what strategies we used to do this. But nothing touched my heart more than when a young lady from the US called Erika Hagen came to Kibera. And this is Kibera itself here, and put young people together using open source software. They call it Map Kibera, and then was ground truth. They digitized the entire Kibera. And before that, what we knew of Kibera was from satellite. This is a 2-kilometer square area. And in government circles, the maps of government, this was Kibera. Nobody knew anybody in Kibera. nobody understood Kibera. So there were many stories out of Kibera. NGOs would say there are 1 million people living here, simply because that would attract more funding. And eventually, after they did the mapping, you can see they mapped all the assets. They knew everybody who lived there. They knew the stories of the people who lived in Kibera. And these young people were doing this. When launching it, I went to launch this, and they asked me, can we see the Minister for Education? I said, no problem. The thing is that the entire 2 kilometer square, the government had only 4% of schools. 96% were either funded by NGOs, church groups, and that's about the time the government had a policy that no students from private schools who can have access to elite public schools. So when we went to see the Minister for Education, he said, that's not possible. Every school in there is public. I said, Mr. Minister, this is Olympic, one of the schools, and we counted, and then we counted the private school. He was shaken, but eventually he changed policy. And that's when I knew that if you create visibility, it impacts on policy, because policymakers make policy without numbers, without knowing who they are making policy for. This was the first point that I began to love data. The second one, I think most of you read about it, is when the University of Nairobi, Oxford University, and Kenyatta National Hospital came together and dug all the entire data in the oncology division and analyzed it and came up with the results. You can check when you go home that cancer or different types of cancer can be associated with your ethnicity, which is a major step that probably we are getting closer to answering questions about cancer. Maybe they are environmental, but that is a major leap with respect to cancer. This was just dead data, which is there, and nobody had touched it. They took for the past 25 years and did the analytics. But the bigger one is maize yields. I took this from a small company called Grow Intelligence. I have harvested data from all over the world, both structured and unstructured. But the point I want to make here is that US started collecting data in 18-something, but they had suffered for many, many years with respect to the yields in maize. But somewhere in the 1930s, when they had the major recession, they had the Agricultural Act. This is a policy which intervened. Policy intervention changed, and they began to see the yields coming up. Today, US does about 11 tons per hectare. This is Africa, which started collecting data in the 1960s. But if you see the top country here is South Africa. They are doing 4 tons per hectare, which is not even half what the US is doing. Most of the other countries, Kenya, for example, they are doing 1.6 tons per hectare. Ethiopia is coming up, and Ethiopia, it was because of the wake-up call from 1984 that they are looking at the yields much more closely. So most of Africa is not even where US was in the 1930s. Now, see what is happening next year. Whereas US, after improving the yields, they use only smaller acreage, which is coming down. Africa, this blue, has actually equal acreage with the US, but they don't produce even 1/5 of what US produces from the same acreage. So people themselves are beginning to farm much bigger spaces to be able to feed themselves. And you begin to understand the problem of food security in Africa, that even today we're having food security, but we're not looking at numbers to figure out where the problem is. The land sizes are becoming smaller, the population is growing, but we are not looking at data. This is a crisis that is going to happen. Next is that if you look at Africa, which is 24 million square kilometers, Texas is like several thousands times the size of Africa. Texas has 932 weather stations, almost the same as the whole of Africa. What this says is that we are not able to predict weather much more precisely because we don't have data points like other countries have, like in the US, they are able to predict. Just recently, we had severe weather in Mauritius. If it was in CNN, they would not have known. And even when they knew, they didn't move because when people told them to move, they were asking them, are you God? So even our culture is a problem towards this. So I want to brag that even when I left government, I did not desert this sector. I became more in love with the data. So I came together with a bunch of friends. This one used to head World Bank, was the chief economist, World Bank, and this one used to be a chief economist here now in Europe. We came together to create something called World Data Lab. This here, everybody you talk to about data, they talk about that it's the next oil. So we mine, we extract the data, especially poverty data, income, risk factors, demography, and then we process it, consolidate it, cleanse it, analyze it, and then it becomes much easier for policymakers to use it. But more importantly, we personalize it such that just by yourself, you can go in and check and begin to take care of the risk factors that would impact you if you don't make changes. We have a site called population.io. When you have time, www.population.io. If you honestly put your date of birth there and where you were born, we can predict when you are going to die. But that is not. But don't get scared. We have also taken care of several risk factors. And if you know, like I know I'll probably die in 2040, I could actually prolong that. I could prolong that if I don't smoke, because smoke takes about 2 years off your expected life of death. If you are born in certain places, if the risk factors are high, if there is HIV around, if there is, if we can't deal with the issues that I talked about, some of the diseases that we know about, those would actually take you much faster. So we are warning you so that you are able to take care of the risk factors and extend your life beyond that period. And for policymakers to begin to understand that this data is important, we need to do this for the population. We need a conversation around SDGs, for example, because they are related, interrelated. Poverty is related to education, it's related to healthcare, environment is related to all this, such that we begin to create conversations around those risk factors that would impact on us and our lives as we move forward. We have another aspect that we look at. It's how much would I and this is so important. From the data, we are able to know now how many people can move out of poverty if the growth rate remains at 5%. The reason why in Vision 2030 we said we must grow at 10% so that we can be out of poverty by 2030. SDGs say you must grow at a minimum of 7%. Most African countries are not growing at that rate. So when we take Kenya, for example, Kenya has about 9 million people who are below poverty line, who are earning $1.25 per day. How do we pull those people out of poverty by 2030? There are several factors that we have listed, and governments must begin to look at. When you remove those people out of poverty, it means there will be less crime, there will be more educated people, there will be the environment, they can take care of the environment. So there are so many factors that are related to this. So we are looking at that and saying, please just go to population.io. Even if you know, don't tell anybody when you go. So that's the next. But the point why I risk my life to come and talk to you here is that some of you are very key to data or to unleashing data for digital transformation. The civil society goes around saying that we can't use data. Data, for example, the one that is collected from you passively, like the mobile data, is more accurate in terms of inflation than the basket that we look at. Some of it can allow the financial sector to deal with us more humanely because we have that data. But we are stuck with talking about that privacy is more important. And I'm telling you here today that there is nothing more important than us using that data to solve some of the most pressing problems. And because I know the private sector is big in terms of data protection, I am also asking you to give that data philanthropically so that we can use it to solve many problems, such that if we solve the poverty, you can drive through easily without fear someone would attack you. The NGOs have a lot of data. Please, let us use that data. Government, we still ask that we need a legal framework that would enable young people to use data. For example, in health sector, we could change it completely by unleashing the data on a daily basis. Yeah. If we get that data, even the policymaker himself would be able to see when there is a crisis. If there are 1,000 people who visited a hospital and 800 have reported diarrhea, you actually know there is a crisis and you can sort it out. So please, let us unleash data so that we can transform our economies. Thank you.